begins with A. Bug begins with B. Cat begins with C. Doll begins with D. Egret begins with E. Flower begins with F. Goat begins with G. Horse begins with H. Icebox begins with I. Jump rope begins with J. Kite begins with K. Lion begins with L. Mouse begins with M. Nest begins with N. Oranges begin with O. Pet begins with P. Quarter begins with Q. Rabbit begins with R. Snake begins with S. Turtle begins with T. Umbrella begins with U. Van begins with V. Whale begins with W. Xylophone begins with X. Yellow begins with Y. Zebra begins with Z. Boys and girls, let's practice, but say begins with letter A. Begins with letter A. Bug begins with letter B. Cat begins with letter C. Doll begins with letter D. Egret begins with letter E. Flower begins with letter F. Goat begins with letter G. Horse begins with letter H. Icebox begins with letter I. Jump rope begins with letter J. Kite begins with letter K. Lion begins with letter L. Mouse begins with letter M. Nest begins with letter N. Oranges begins with letter O. Pet begins with letter P. Quarter begins with letter Q. Rabbit begins with letter R. Snake begins with letter S. Turtle begins with letter T. Umbrella begins with letter U. Van begins with letter V. Whale begins with letter W. Xylophone begins with letter X. Yellow begins with letter Y. Zebra begins with letter Z.